So when I made the decision to post more videos on this channel covering Avatar: The Last Airbender, I knew there was one type of comment I would inevitably receive. Now I want to hear you talk about Legend of Korra, lol. Okay, I'm new here, but I would love to know your thoughts on The Legend of Korra, a show I have a tough time loving and a tough time hating. Everything that makes the Avatar great is what makes The Legend of Korra an absolute disgrace. Legend of Korra is better, don't at me. And whenever I've seen comments like these mentioning Avatar: The Last Airbender's infamous sequel show, my reaction is usually just, well, to quote Jose Mourinho,
I prefer really not to speak. If I speak, I am in big trouble. In big trouble. And I don't want to be in big trouble.
Here's the deal, people. I just don't know if I even want to talk about The Legend of Korra, you know? It's just not one of those things I've exactly been itching to make a video about. And I think that becomes obvious when you consider how little I've mentioned the show across all my Avatar: The Last Airbender stuff. So, why is this? Why am I so reluctant to talk about The Legend of Korra? Well, there are two main reasons. Number one, I do not like this show. Now, I'm gonna be very careful with what I say here. I don't want to shoot myself in the foot by being disrespectful or overly emotional about it, and I fully understand that lots of people love this show. But at the end of the day, The Legend of Korra is personally one of my least favourite pieces of art ever. I've watched the entire series 2 or 3 times in my life, and unfortunately the only thing it's ever really made me feel is severe disappointment. Maybe I'll go into detail on why this is at a later date. In fact, I might even do a huge review of each season like I'm currently doing with the original show, but in this moment, it's not really relevant. As we all know, the internet is just filled with so much negativity, and I've never wanted to contribute towards that. I've never wanted to give into extreme hate, even if those types of channels and videos usually do very well. For example, there's this video essay about the Star Wars prequels I've thought about making for a while, where I essentially discuss the psychology behind how they've become, in my opinion, some of the most overrated movies of all time. And look, maybe I will tackle that eventually, because I do think it's pretty interesting. But sometimes you just have to stop and ask yourself, what would Uncle Iroh do here? Like, if he had a YouTube channel discussing film and television, what would it look like? Now, I'm not too sure on this answer, but what he definitely wouldn't do is complain into a microphone for 20 minutes about George Lucas or Brie Larson or that poor Snow White actress, or indeed, The Legend of Korra. And honestly, that feels like the healthier option. The truth is, blind love and blind hate both make for bad analysis, at least in my opinion. What I've always found interesting, and what I've always tried to lean into on this channel, is nuance and, you know, the middle ground. That's why even in my videos on Avatar: The Last Airbender, a show I absolutely adore, a show that genuinely changed my life, I still spend a fair amount of time critiquing it. For me, that's a big part of engaging with art properly. Recognizing the flaws as well as the brilliance, because being honest about where it falls short makes the strengths shine that much brighter. The problem with The Legend of Korra is there's just not much middle ground for me, and I think I'll leave it there for now. However, the second and actually more important reason as to why I don't really want to discuss The Legend of Korra on this channel is due to the discourse which surrounds it, which is some of the strangest I have ever encountered on the internet. It is truly a surreal experience to browse through a Legend of Korra comment section or forum or whatever. Like, there is such a blatant lack of communication that, of course, no one can agree on it. We're not even talking about the same thing most of the time. See, when people talk about Korra on the internet, they're usually referring to one of 3 things. Number 1, The Legend of Korra, the American animated fantasy action drama television series created by Michael Dante DiMartino and Brian Konietzko for Nickelodeon, which ran from 2012 to 2014. You know, the show this whole video is about. Number 2, Korra the character, the fictional protagonist we follow across those 4 seasons. And then we have number 3, Korra the Avatar and human being. And this, folks, is where things get truly bizarre, because people will more often than not conflate these 3 very different entities, if you will, treating them as if they are interchangeable, and they're just not. See, talking about the quality of The Legend of Korra as a show means talking about its writing, pacing, animation, world building, you know, the craft. Talking about Korra as a character is related, sure, but it's a narrower conversation about how she's conceived, portrayed, and developed on screen. But Korra as the Avatar, well, that's an in-universe performance review and is completely irrelevant to the conversation. Like, whether Korra is a good avatar or a bad avatar has absolutely no bearing on the quality of the show itself, right? Yet, so often, discussions around Korra just collapse into endless arguments about her competence. And to be clear, this is something I see from all sides of the fandom. Like just a few weeks ago, I saw this post on Reddit comparing Aang and Korra. And there I was thinking, oh nice, that might be interesting. You know, they're both complex characters who are written quite differently. Let's see what people have to say. However, both the thread and most of the comments were just stuff like, but Aang would never have made the same mistakes Korra did, and yeah, but Korra fought more villains, and why aren't these two avatars held to the same standards? And it was seriously getting quite emotional and heated, and I was just sat there like, guys, these are fictional characters, yeah? Like, they're literally drawings, they're not real. And look, I can kind of understand why it might be fun to compare the characters in universe. You know, power scaling, who would beat who in a fight, that sort of thing. It's the kind of discussions we used to have in the playground at school. But when that bleeds into conversations about writing and quality, it gets very silly very quickly. It actually really reminds me of those recent comments James Gunn made in response to people saying his version of Superman wasn't strong enough or whatever. And he basically said he could just create a character called God-Man who can destroy his enemies with a wink, and how basically the entire conversation is really stupid and irrelevant. And yeah, he's spot on, obviously. Like, you could write an avatar who was the greatest avatar of all time, who stopped 1,000 wars and ushered in a peaceful utopian paradise for 1,000,000 years, and it could be terrible. You could also write an avatar who was genuinely evil and destroyed the entire universe, and it could be amazing. The point is, questions of competence or peacekeeping abilities or whatever have absolutely no place in a discussion about storytelling quality. Yet so often these two things are intermingled, and it is surreal to see. For example, this whole thing about Korra losing her connection to all the past avatars. Now look, I understand if you weren't a fan of this, right? Believe me, I get it. But your opinion is completely invalidated when you criticize Korra for this, because Korra is not real. She can't hurt you. It feels so silly to even say this out loud, but honestly, you'd be surprised at the kind of discussions which go down sometimes. And the sad thing is, both these shows offer up such a valuable masterclass in writing, a goldmine of what to do and what not to do. You can learn so much about storytelling from analysing them, and yet the discourse usually just divulges into these vague, confusing arguments about Korra, but with no real agreement on what people are actually even talking about. And it sucks, because I'm really getting the impression that this new Avatar series, Seven Havens or whatever it's called, is going to be partially a response to the backlash of Korra the Avatar. Now, this probably deserves a whole separate video, but to summarise briefly, it looks like they're setting up a kind of meta storyline. A post-apocalyptic world where Korra is blamed for everything, where people dislike both her and the very idea of the Avatar. And then, over time, I imagine the reveal will come that she actually saved the world from some even greater threat, kind of like the Kuruk twist in the Kyoshi novels. Which, if I'm right, means the whole thing is going to double as a commentary on how Korra herself has been misunderstood and unfairly hated. Basically, what worries me is that they'll end up taking the most unfair, surface-level criticisms of Korra, you know, the ones that focus on her supposed failures as an avatar, rather than on the actual writing of her character and/or show, and just bundle all those criticisms together before dismissing them as objectively false. In other words, they're going to canonize the idea that all criticism of Korra was misguided from the start, despite the fact that plenty of people were simply disappointed by the show's writing and raised valid critiques without being arseholes about it. So yeah, we have that to look forward to. The other thing I can't really stand about the Legend of Korra discourse, and this kind of links into my last point, is the way people online will basically... how do I put this? They'll essentially speak on behalf of anyone who has a problem with the show, and dismiss their criticisms out of hand with these vague, patronizing, oversimplifying claims, which just completely miss the point. In other words, you'll have strangers who know nothing about you enlightening you on the real reasons you don't like The Legend of Korra, and why your opinions are actually invalid. Now, despite being a member of Gen Z, I'm not too sure on the lingo here. I want to say this is gatekeeping, or gaslighting, or something like that. It definitely begins with a G, but anyway, let's actually dive into some common examples of what I'm talking about, because honestly, as a Legend of Korra critic, this is something I've wanted to get off my chest for a while. Let's start off with an absolute classic. You just don't like The Legend of Korra because it's not Avatar: The Last Airbender. What does this even mean? Are you saying I'm only able to like Avatar: The Last Airbender and nothing else? I mean, I don't know, I like The Godfather. That's not Avatar: The Last Airbender, so clearly I do in fact have the ability to like things other than Avatar: The Last Airbender. Okay, but obviously I'm being a bit flippant here. What people actually mean is, within the Avatar universe, critics like me just can't handle anything beyond the original gang and the original tone. We're just too nostalgic to accept something new. Well, then how do you explain the Kyoshi novels, which introduce a completely new cast, a new setting, a new tone, and which I and many others think are fantastic? And what about the Avatar comics, which feature the entire original cast and yet don't land for me at all? So no, it's not simply a case of people clinging to the old characters or tone. It's obviously a lot more complicated than that. Next up we have, you just don't like The Legend of Korra because you're comparing it to Avatar: The Last Airbender. Instead, you should judge it as its own thing. So this is something I touched upon in my Edgar Wright ranked video, so if you'll just allow me to paraphrase what I said there. I think comparison is a very natural and fair tendency to have when discussing and judging art. And I've never really understood people who condemn this, who say, no, you have to critique every piece of art as its own individual thing. Like, why? Don't get me wrong, I do think you should be able to separate a piece of art from its greater lore and legend, but I don't necessarily think you should, because context is important. The relationships a film or a TV show has to other works are important. They shape our expectations and understanding and are just as valid a part of the conversation as anything else. I mean, look at the Kuleshov effect. This whole medium of moving pictures is about the relationship between images, between ideas. So yes, of course I'm going to have Avatar: The Last Airbender in mind when watching and discussing The Legend of Korra. It is a sequel to the original. It is set in the same world as the original. It constantly harkens back to the original. It deals with the legacy of the original. It was even made by the same studio and the same creators as the original. Now, don't get me wrong. Even judged in a vacuum, I still personally think The Legend of Korra is a poorly written show. But it's even sadder because we know what these writers are capable of. And look, you can absolutely bring up the behind-the-scenes chaos that Michael Dante DiMartino and Brian Konietzko faced. And that does explain some of the show's weaker writing. And honestly, while I'm not a fan of The Legend of Korra, I do respect that they wanted to do something different, and I do feel sorry for them that they weren't able to create the show they truly had envisioned like last time. But unfortunately, that doesn't change the end result. It partially explains why The Legend of Korra had all these structural problems, sure, but it doesn't make them go away. The end product is the end product. And then there's the more specific ones, like the whole debate about how different The Legend of Korra's world feels compared to the original. There's quite a lot of, in my opinion, valid criticism of the technology, the westernization, and the modern city aesthetic. And whenever that comes up, people will instantly push back by explaining how it actually makes sense historically, that if anything the tech should be even more advanced by this point in the timeline. But for me, that completely misses the point. The issue isn't about historical accuracy, because again, this world is not real, it's made up. No, the point is about tone and writing. Like, I'm sorry, but if someone finds it kinda jarring to go from this beautiful, mythic world to something that feels more akin to The Great Gatsby, that's okay. At the end of the day, you can't really get too annoyed at people for having these feelings. Avatar is this incredible piece of art we all have a strong emotional attachment to. People are always going to process it differently, and that's fine. All opinions are valid, guys. So stop telling people what they can and can't think, or why they supposedly think the things they do. Let people enjoy stuff, and let people critique stuff. Because really, that's why we can't agree on The Legend of Korra. Yes, because the discourse gets confused. Yes, because fans often talk past each other or dismiss criticism with lazy assumptions. But deeper than that, it's because this franchise means so much to so many people that disagreement is inevitable. And honestly, that's okay. Avatar has always been a story about love, peace, understanding, kinship, about different perspectives finding a way to coexist. So maybe the healthiest response isn't to fight until everyone agrees, but to acknowledge the differences, pour a cup of tea like Uncle Iroh, embrace the fact that we'll never all see it the same way, and move on. And as always, thank you for watching, I hope you have a good day, and I will see you in the next one.